Yeah, so being involved in the school, I don't think that reading and writing and arithmetic, the 3 R's, are the most important thing now. What do I think the most important things for schools? Well, it seems the most important things for schools today is who can have the most signs around their property. I am sure you have noticed, if you've ever gone to the bathroom, or even when we walk over to morning tea, on this school, there are signs everywhere. Well, our high school is no different. They are everywhere. Signs are in walls, on classrooms, and everything. This is one of the main ones, if you come to our high school, that you will see. It's our vision. Every student at Toogoolawah State High School working together every day in every classroom to learn and achieve. Oh, isn't that nice? But let me ask you, what does it say? What does this really say? Well, in a way, it really says nothing. I mean, what does it mean to be working together every day in every classroom to learn and achieve? Well, don't worry. You guessed it. We have a sign about that as well. In fact, these are everywhere. We have signs like this one. I learn and achieve when I do these 4 priority things. And so our school spent ages, going through and working this out. And not that I've got them, but you know what? It gets even better, because we have signs in every classroom and on walls that break these down and tell you what these look like. So it seems that everywhere you turn, especially in school, everything is so easily spelt out for people about what goals, behaviour, attitude and actions we want them to have. I mean, if you have never seen it, I don't know, you must be blind if you haven't seen it, but when you go down, have a look up at morning tea, it will tell you. It spells it out. You can't read that sign and think, what do they want me to do? Everything is spelt out. Everything is there. It's like that old song says, a sign, everywhere a sign. Everywhere you turn, there's a sign. So while it's true that most of us aren't in school anymore, can we really say, aren't we glad we're not in school anymore because we don't have to face stuff like this? I mean, I don't think we can just put our feet up and say, poor kids, I'm glad my learning days are over. Aren't we learning every day? I mean, aren't we taught that every single day on this world you are learning something new? I can't help but think that it's not learning in our lives that's important. I mean, you can learn heaps of stuff and gain heaps of great understanding about certain things or certain topics, but that may not change anything. True learning comes from when you act on what you have learned. Nearly everything we learn requires us to act on it. Have you ever learned something that required you to do a new action, but you deliberately didn't do it? Well, let me ask you, how did it work for you? Well, I've done that. I remember when I was in Cherbourg, and we lived in Cherbourg, and in Mergen, I took up squash, and I played squash at the local squash centre. And it wasn't really good, and I really wanted to improve. And my coach said to me, Garth, you've got 2 main problems with your squash. Your first problem is your racket. I had one of them old rackets, them ones with a little circle that's the size of a table tennis bat. I had one of them. And he said, the second thing is your fitness. He said, your fitness is not good. Well, I can tell you, I took on his advice and I acted on the first one. I went out and I bought a new racket. You can go get squash rackets of the size of tennis rackets. However, I didn't do anything with my fitness. He wrote out this fitness program and I did absolutely none of it. Each week, I tend to lose games in the last 5 minutes. My coach reminded me again and again about my fitness, but I never did anything about it. So in a way, what did I learn? Absolutely nothing. It's not the learning that's important. It's not receiving information that's important. It is acting on what you have learned. You can have an attitude of learning all you like. You can walk into a classroom and think, I'm going to learn all you like. But if you don't act and put into practice what you've learned, I can't help but think you've learned absolutely nothing. Your attitude is worthless. That's why I think in some ways schools have got it right. It's no point us saying to kids, let's work hard to learn and achieve and be good students. Sadly, we live in a spoon-feed society. You've got to tell them how to work hard. You've got to tell them what it means to learn how to achieve. You've got to tell them exactly what you want to do, and you've got to set up the environment for that to take place. I said last time one of the reasons I love the book of James is he doesn't pull any punches. He always cuts straight to the heart of the matter with determination. This is great because there really isn't any room for us to tone down what he's saying. His words are abundantly clear. Well, you can add another thing about the book of James, which I think makes it great. Like schools, he tells us exactly what we are to do. He was before his time in this. And again, in the passage that we're about to look at today, he does it exactly again. He doesn't just say, this is what I want. He then goes and spells it out in a dot formation. If you remember last time we finished chapter 1, James was showing his readers what kind of religion God likes. There is a true and pure religion, and it is an active religion. It's a religion that takes care of people, meeting the needs of those people who are most vulnerable, the most in need. Well, now as we begin in James chapter 2, he becomes even more direct. He's challenging his readers about the ways in which they're failing at their attempts to care for the needy. He's telling them they're not loving others the way he should. And he gives them 3 attributes of God that they should live out. And so that's what we're going to look at today. But as we study and look at this passage today, even though it's not directly written to us, let's come with more than an attitude of just learning. Let's come with more than an attitude of just gaining information. Let's not just get to the end of this and be thankful for a history lesson. Let's not just listen and look at the passage and walk out that door with, wow, I never knew they failed showing those 3 attributes of God. Let's ask ourselves, do I need this challenge? Am I showing these 3 attributes of God in my life in the way I relate to others? If so, let us put it into action, what God reveals to us today. That's when true learning takes place. That's why I believe anyone gets up and teaches, because they want to see action. And I think that's why James wrote what we're about to hear now. Nick's going to come and read this.
The reading today is from James chapter 2, verses 1 to 9. My brothers and sisters, believers in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ must not show favouritism. Suppose a man comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in a filthy old clothes also comes in. Do you show special attention to the man wearing the fine clothes and say, here's a good seat for you? They say to the poor man, you stand over there, or sit at the floor by my feet. Have you not discriminated amongst yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my brothers and sisters. Has not God chosen those who are poor in the eyes of the world to be rich in faith and to inherit the kingdom he promised those who love him? But you dishonour the poor. It's not the rich who are exploiting you, and they are not the ones who are dragging you into court. They are the ones dragging you into court. And they are not the ones they are the ones blaspheming your noble name of him to whom you belong. If you really keep the royal law found in scriptures, love your neighbour as yourself, you're doing the right thing. But if you show favouritism, you sin and are convicted by the law as lawlessness.
Thank you. You know, in life, we all have favourite things. We all have favourite food. We have favourite drinks, music, movies. That's not a problem. But when we start to show favouritism to people, That's a problem. That's a big problem. A problem that seems that these scattered Christians that James is writing to had. What is James' message to them? Sum it up in 3 words. Don't show favouritism. That's why I believe James' first point of what we should live out towards others is this. Live out God's fairness. I can't help but think that this kind of topic would have been close to James's heart. Remember, James is the brother of Jesus. So I believe this topic of accepting people and showing them love would have been one close to his heart. Why? Because he would have witnessed and heard firsthand how Jesus was despised and rejected by those who should have loved him, by those that should have treated him fairly. The religious experts in Jesus' day judged him by their human standards, and they rejected him. Even though we know that he was the very glory of God, he came from the wrong city. He did not graduate in the accepted schools of his day. He did not have the official approval of the people in power. He had no wealth. His followers were no more than dull mob and included publicans and sinners. And how did Jesus respond to them? Jesus was a friend to the sinners and the unworthy of his day. Sure, he disapproved of their sin, but he was still with them and they with him. Why? The time he spent hanging out with sinners and the unworthy was not a compromise. It was a sign of fairness. It was a sign of compassion. It was compassion and fairness that caused Jesus to have an attitude that welcomed the unworthy. And I believe James would have seen and saw that firsthand. He would have seen how people treated his brother compared how his brother treated others. And that's why I believe James' point that we get to is that we should live out God's fairness towards others. You will notice that James seems to point to some hypothetical example of a situation of a meeting. And he says, suppose someone comes into your meeting and they're rich or they're wearing special clothes and you think, oh, so good to have you. Come over here and let's come and we'll sit you here. And then someone else comes in and they're a bit shabby and they've got nothing and they ignore them. His example is all tied up with clothes and money. How someone looked or what they had determined on how they were treated. Now, there is a debate as to whether James is just making this up with an analogy, or was he referring to a situation that was actually happening, something that they would all know about? Well, as you know, most scholars, they fight, but most scholars believe the latter. They actually believe James isn't just talking about some hypothetical scenario here. They believe James is confronting them on a specific situation that was happening to visitors that were coming to their Christian meetings. They were showing favouritism. The more they had, the more they looked, the more they got. How someone looked and what they had determined how they were treated. Well, how bad is that? Aren't you glad we've moved on from that? Or have we? Again, before we say we'd never do this, let's ask ourselves, do I need to be challenged in this? I can't help but think we often still today make the same mistake. When visitors come into our churches, we tend to judge them on what we see outwardly. We look at their dress, their colour of skin, their fashion and other superficial things. The way we sometimes look and act, we believe these superficial things carry weight. Now again, you may think you've never done this, but I think if we all have a good hard look at ourselves and our past, I'm quite sure you'll realise we've all done it. We've all been there and done it. Myself included. I remember a night when my mum, who doesn't go to church, she dropped me off at church because my car was getting fixed. This is in Adelaide. And out the front of church, she saw people who were going into church wearing shorts, t-shirts and thongs. She was shocked and horrified. And she said she couldn't believe that people would go to church wearing clothes like that. Have you ever been shocked and horrified at something or some other Christian about what they've done or the way they look? Well, what did you do about it? What did you do with that shock? Well, it's exact action or response that James is confronting here. Obviously, these Christians weren't doing a good job accepting people the way James's brother did. They weren't living out God's fairness. So here's the challenge for us. Whenever someone comes to church, we need to show spiritual maturity and see that person as Christ. We must show God's fairness. Our Father does not look at the outward appearance. He looks at the heart. I had a friend in Adelaide who was involved in a cult. As part of the cult, she was taught that she had to wear certain types of clothes to please and be accepted by God. Some of you may know of the Immaculate Brethren cult, where they have to wear headbands and stuff like that. They're pretty big in Adelaide. And I befriended one. They were only allowed to wear dresses, sandals, and head coverings. They would go to the shops looking like that. They would go everywhere looking like that at Edwardstown. When Jesus saved her from that cult, she commented to me that she remembered the great feeling of freedom that she had at the time of her conversion, something she'd never experienced before. But let me tell you, it wasn't the great freedom of forgiveness of sins like most of us would probably have experienced and remember from our conversion. For her, she said the great freedom was this. For the first time in her life, she believed and knew God accepted her no matter what she wore. Wow. When I was in Cherbourg, a lot of elders used to say to me, all men should wear ties to church. That's what they were taught by missionaries. I told them if they wanted to wear a tie to church, you feel free. But we can never force others to have the same value on that. We don't have a right to tell others how to dress for church. You feel that it's important to get dressed up for church, then get dressed up for church. That's fine. You may think that it doesn't matter what you wear because you can come to church because God accepts you no matter what you wear. That's fine too. But here's the trap. What's not fine is when we start to treat others differently or put our expectations onto others. If you believe people should wear ties, you wear a tie. But if someone doesn't, that has nothing to do with their spirituality. What does James say when we do this type of stuff? He says you are discriminating amongst yourselves and you have become judges with evil thoughts. As I said, I've seen this work in my own life. I've been prone to judge people by what I see. I know at times I look at people who seem to be leaders or influential people. Well, they're over the top. They're out there people. They're good at relationships or whatever. And I think, wow, how good would it be if that person became a Christian? Imagine the change that person could make if they got saved. I don't get quite as excited or have the same thoughts when I look at quiet, reserved people. The ones that are in the corner. I don't really look at them and think, wow, how great would it be if they became a Christian? Other times I know I've judged people by their past and not their future. I was involved in a course called Master Life. I don't know if you ever remember Master Life. It's a 8-week program. But in Master Life, it was about you had to pick 3 people and be praying for 3 people and you befriend them in a hope to lead them to Christ. And there was one guy at Coles at Port Adelaide and I befriended him and, we befriended and we played table tennis together and everything like this. And the leader of my Master Life group said, we'll be praying for you and him. We'll really be praying for him. And I'll be honest, this was my response. Oh, don't bother praying. I know him. He'll never become a Christian. Because I knew his past. I knew what he was like. In both the situations above I just mentioned, I'm looking at people from the wrong eyes. I had become and done exactly what James says not to do. I had become discriminative myself and I had evil thoughts. How do we change this? Well, when someone is in our lives or in our church or outside the church, we need to show spiritual maturity and see that person as Christ would. I always remember my leader's response to me when I said, don't bother praying about him, the comment. He looked at me and he said, Garth, what if that school teacher in Broken Hill had the same thought about you? Don't bother sharing the gospel with Garth. He's never going to become a Christian. My leader had godly eyes. When we start to live like this, we show spiritual maturity and we're more like Jesus. we start to live out the fairness of God. He was not impressed with riches or social status. The poor widow who gave her mite was greater in his eyes than the rich Pharisee who gave a large donation. He not only looked on the outside of people, he saw potential in the lives of sinners. In Simon, he saw a rock. In Matthew, the publican, he saw a faithful disciple who would one day write one of the Gospels. The disciples were amazed to see Jesus talking to a sinful woman at a well, but Jesus saw in her an instrument of reaping a great harvest. There's a whole list of them in Scripture that God has come to and touched and empowered. And you know who else you can add to the list? You. Seriously. Imagine if God wasn't fair to you. Where would you be today if God treated you on what you had or what you wore when you first came to him? Think about it. All you wore was a whole lot of dirty, filthy sin. That's what you were clothed in. They were the clothes that you brought into there. And what riches did you have? Absolutely nothing. You were spiritually bankrupt. He would have been completely right to wipe you right out of his presence. He would have said, "No, you're not dressed properly. You're too sinful. You're bringing nothing to the table." He could have said, "There's no special seat for you. There's no special place." But he didn't. He was fair. He was above fair. How do we practice the beauty of Christ in our own human relationships? It's really quite simple. Look at everyone through the eyes of Christ. If someone is a Christian, we can accept them because Christ lives in them. If someone is not a Christian, we can receive them and be fair to them because we know Christ died for them. God shows no favouritisms, neither should Christians. It is Christ who is the link between us and others, and that link is the link of love. I have a thing by Bill Gates. I quite like it. It's his 10 Commandments. I don't know if you've ever seen it. He got asked to come and speak to a group of high school students about how to change their life. You would love it. And he was given 2 hours or an hour. He said, "I won't need it. I should have got him up for you." He said, "I won't need it." He said, "Give me 5 minutes." He said, "Give me 2 minutes." And he goes through and he lists these things, these 10 commandments of life that he calls it. And rule number 1 is this. Commandment number 1 for Bill Gates is this. Life's not fair, get used to it. If you're going to go through life expecting to be fair, you're doomed. Life's not fair, get used to it. That's his opening statement. Well, let me tell you, in God, life is fair. Get used to it. In the world, life's not fair. But in God, life is extremely fair. We've experienced that fairness ourselves. We wore the wrong clothes and we came bankrupt, yet we received it. Now for the next one. They are to live out God's grace. Talk about an upside down world. In verses 5 to 7, James points out a big mistake in favouring the rich. He says, do you know what? I call this early psychology. I'm not sure if you've ever done any counselling courses or training, but one question we're taught to ask in helping people understand something is this. Have you ever asked yourself? They said that's one of the most powerful questions you can have in counselling. Have you ever asked yourself, what would it be like if I didn't drink today? Have you ever asked yourself, why do I get upset when my wife tells me what to do, but I don't mind it when others do it? Have you ever asked yourself, why do I need to lie all the time? You get the picture. Have you ever asked yourself? Well, here in James 4, James put these 4 questions to them. To me, these verses are a bit like this. Guys, why are you favouring the rich? Have you ever asked yourself, has not God chosen you, the poor? Have you ever asked yourself, is it not the rich who are exploiting you? Have you ever asked yourself, aren't they the ones who are dragging you into court? Have you ever asked yourselves, are they not the ones who are slandering the noble of him whom you belong to? Have you ever asked yourself, why are you favouring them when they're doing these 4 things? I know it's a horrible thing to say, but for me, James is saying, why favour the rich? Because God's chosen the poor, of which you were one. Why favour the rich when they're the ones exploiting you, suing you, slandering you and your God? The emphasis here isn't on putting the rich down. James is rather stating some truths about the poor that they were neglecting. James is pointing his readers to the fact that God chooses us involves the grace of God because we are poor. We come with nothing. If salvation were on the basis of merit, it would not be by grace. Grace implies God's sovereign choice. It comes to those who cannot earn it. It comes to those who do not deserve it. And as I just said, it comes to us because when we first met God, we were clothed in sin and we brought no riches whatsoever. God saves us completely on the basis of the work of Christ on the cross and not because of anything that we are or we have. God ignores national differences. God ignores social differences. God ignores whether you're a master, a slave, or rich, or poor. They are all alike to him. There is no favouritism. Everyone receives the same grace of God. James teaches us that the grace of God makes the rich man poor because he cannot depend on his wealth. It also teaches us that it makes the poor man rich because the poor inherit the riches of God's grace. The doctrine of God's grace, if we really believe it, forces us to relate to people on the basis of God's plan, not on human status. Do you know one of the big issues that everyone says about this COVID situation is it seems there are these kind of rules for one person and these kind of rules for someone else. There are different levels and most people hate it. Living out God's fairness and God's grace is so important. We are to relate to people on the basis of God's plan for them, not their material status. In his birth, life and death, Jesus broke down the walls between rich and poor, young and old, educated and uneducated. And it is wrong for us to build up those walls again. But that's what they were doing. We cannot rebuild them if we believe in the grace of God. We must live out that grace of God to others. And the last one, you could say these are all the same and they kind of are. But live out God's love. In verses 8 to 11, James reaches back into the Old Testament of one of God's laws. And it's this. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against your people, but love your neighbour as yourself. I am the Lord. That's from Leviticus 19:18. In his parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus told us that our neighbour is anyone who needs help. It's not a matter of geography. It's a matter of opportunity. The important question is not who is my neighbour. The important question is to whom can I be a neighbour? Why is love thy neighbour called the royal law? Why is he called love thy neighbour the royal law? Well, for one thing, it's given by a king. God the Father gave the law, so that makes it royal. But love thy neighbour is the royal law for a second reason. It rules all other laws. Paul says in Romans 13, love is the fulfilling of the law. Living out God's love is that. There would be no need for thousands of complex laws if each person truly loved his neighbour. It's like when they came to trick Jesus and said, what's the greatest commandment? He says the greatest commandment is love the Lord your God. Love your neighbour as yourself. He says if you're doing that, you've got them all. What a difference it would make to live out love. Hatred makes a person a slave. Love sets them free from selfishness and enables them to be free and enjoy life. Love enables us to obey the word of God and treat people as God commands us to do. Living out the love of God does not mean that I must like every person. Living out the love of God does not mean that I must agree with every person. I may not like some people's bad language. I may not like some people's habits. I may not want them to be an intimate friend of mine. I may not want to go and have lunch with them every day. So what does it mean? Well, it means this. Living out the love of God means treating others the way God has treated me. It's an act of the will. It's not an emotion that I try and manufacture. The motive is to glorify God. I find it so interesting when you look at James. Let's go back to James chapter 1. James chapter 1 is all about trials, all about the hard times. But what's his message? God's with you. God's going to take care of you. God's going to do this. Pray for wisdom and God will do it. You're not going to break. He's there. Right? He spends his whole chapter 1 telling us what God has done in our lives. And now he says, right, now you know that. Here's a pure religion. Go and live that out to others. Go and care for others. Don't show favouritism. Go out and do exactly what the means is the power of the Spirit within. As I act and love towards others, I might find myself drawn more and more to them. I remember I was struggling with someone and I'll be honest, I hated this person. And God kept bringing this person in my life. And I went and chatted with my mentor in Adelaide and he said, pray for him. Go and tell God how much you hate him. Make sure you tell God all the things that you hate. And I went and did it and I couldn't finish. I don't know if you ever tried this. But I started to go and complain about this person and his certain behaviours and the more I tried to do it, I just couldn't because it kept coming, you hypocrite. What have I forgiven you of? How can you be that way towards him after all I've done for you? I wasn't living out God's love to him. And thanks to my mentor, it came out. We are to give out what God has given to us. This, is living out the love of God. So I'm not sure if you've taken my advice or if you were listening today and asked yourself the question, do I need to be challenged in any of these areas? Do I need to be challenged living out God's fairness, living out God's grace, or living out God's love? If you did, then chances are you've listened today and you've come to the same conclusion that I have many times when God challenges me. This kind of living is hard. This isn't easy. This isn't nice. Loving others, not judging them and not showing favouritism is not a formula we human beings can easily live by. It is so much easier to rank people. It is so much easier to have a caste system. It is so much easier to put people down. To live out and show the type of love I've been talking about here today isn't easy. So how do we do it? It can only come by yielding to Christ Jesus, seeing his love for us. How much fairness and grace and love has God shown to us, seeing how much he has lived out and shown that fairness, grace and love towards us, then showing and living out that love to others. What others? All. Everyone. You know, I wish God said, look and show love to people that you click with or that you get along with. Show grace and love to those who are going to appreciate it. How much easier would that been if he said something like that? Show love to this group over there who are going to welcome you, but don't worry about those over there. Let them go. But he doesn't say that. The Bible and James doesn't say that. The Bible and James says these attributes of God are to be lived out and shown to all of those around you. You are his worker in his vineyard, and those around you have been put into your life by God. I'm sure you've all heard it said before. You may be the only chance these people ever get to see a loving, graceful Jesus. So live it out. Can I put one final challenge to you today? As you leave here today, ask God to reveal to you, am I judging anyone at the moment? Am I treating anyone fairly at the moment? Am I not showing fairness, grace and love towards someone? Ask God to reveal that someone to you. Ask him, is there someone I need to go to and see because I haven't been looking at that person the way you do, God? I pray that all of us as the body of Christ here at Toogoolawah Baptist Church will truly be a blessing and accept everyone that comes through our door and into our life by living out God's fairness, by living out God's grace, and by living out